Hello, I'm Fahmidul Haq. I'm visiting professor at Bard College, affiliated with Experimental Humanities. I'm here with Professor Thomas Keenan, who is the director of Human Rights Project here in the Bard College, the author of Fables of Responsibility, and co-author of Mengel's Skull, and he has edited several books with other scholars and professors. So I'm very glad to have a conversation with Professor Tom Keenan. I welcome you to this conversation, Tom.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Famid. I'm so happy we're doing this.
Yeah, I'm happy too. We are thinking of have a discussion or conversation in the area of human rights and its connection with media communication, and especially maybe in the digital platforms. What might be the connection between human rights and communication or media? We have been seeing a long era of print media, then broadcast media. Now we have been going through digital media at the time of digital media. So how do you see this interconnection between human rights, defending human rights, and communication?
I think it's extremely intimate, that connection. Probably, you could produce some theorem like, at least in the past 200 or 200 something ish years, there wouldn't be human rights defending, there wouldn't be human rights claiming if there weren't media of one sort or another. Where you could go back to I don't know where we start the story. We could start the story at the telegraph, which was so important in connecting very far away spaces in virtually real time. We could talk about photography. We could talk about newsprint, all the way through the successive stages of media, whether it's radio, TV, film, and to our present digital moment. But I think human rights claiming or human rights defending is fundamentally about getting other people to pay attention. There's no such thing as human rights work or human rights advocacy without spectators and listeners and without an audience, effectively. Sometimes the audience can be very small and precise. You need one person to do one thing. But I think that's a rare situation. More generally, it's about mobilizing larger groups of people, whether to protest or to put pressure on corporations or elected leaders or unelected leaders. There's a whole, there's a long history of what's known as mobilizing shame in the human rights world, trying to use publicity to shame human rights violators or their defenders or protectors into doing something different, into ceasing the violations, into taking responsibility or insisting on accountability and so on. So I think all of that, in all of that work, media are absolutely essential. Sharon Slowinski has a really excellent book called Human Rights in Camera, which is part of a series of scholarly works over the last decade, which has really insisted that visibility and audibility of the suffering of some to the ears and eyes of others is the core dimension of human rights campaigning. We know Sontag's work on that. We know Ariella Azule's work on that as well. So much attention has been paid to it. But I think we could draw bigger conclusions, like no human rights without media. So for me, this conversation it's not a kind of special little niche in a broader discussion about human rights. It's an absolutely fundamental question. No one would ever think about talking about human rights without talking about protest or without talking about law or without talking about violence. But I think a lot of people think they can get away with talking about human rights and not mentioning media. And I think that's a big tactical and essential error. So I'm glad we get to rectify it from the very start right here. I don't know, you've had your own sets of experiences and you've studied this as well. Do you have a sense about this? You offered me a leading question, so I think I know where you were leading, but what's your take on it?
Actually, people like me, we have been going through the traditional media practices. At the same time, before getting too old, we have been also experiencing digital media platforms. I've seen both eras very closely, and we have been seeing the difference of defending human rights analog forms and digital forms. The conventional media were like very defined, and we knew the characteristics of the media. We knew the architecture and the formation of the media. So we knew what to do and what are the modes of engaging with media to defend human rights of people. But this digital era, we have been also having that conventional media, but at the same time we have seen a proliferation of digital media, which are very new kind of thing. But sometimes it is liberating. These media are liberating. Sometimes these media forms are like enchaining us. I mean, it's not against human rights. Sometimes it has been used by the conservative people. Actually, the very early era of digital media, it was used by the progressive liberal people. But as the time goes, we have been seeing a rise of right-wing populism in digital media. So the rulers, governments, they have been using it in a new manner. At the same time, audience, they have been also using in their own ways. And both progressive and conservatives, all of them are here, but it seems it is a very chaotic place and a battleground of political ideals. So it's very important to understand the digital platforms, how to use these digital platforms for defending human rights. So we'll be discussing more on this area, and my next question is to you is we have been experiencing some theoretical notions of network public. It's by Jainab Tufekci. The book was published in 2017, but before that, Manuel Castells, perhaps he published this idea in 2007, the network society, where the kind of horizontal communication is going on, and people are united quickly, and they are demanding something, maybe in this case human rights, and these theoretical notions are very important to understand this kind of social movement by using digital media. But I want to know from you, how do you see using these digital platforms for defending human rights?
I should confess that I'm not much of a social media digital platform user. I'm sometimes a spectator, but I'm not so much a user. But I have tried to think about it. I think that, just to go back through what you were saying, the question about networks is really important, and we're obviously in a much more networked and networky world today than we were even 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We had we had what we called television networks, but they were more top-down operations. They were maybe pyramids, as opposed to more horizontal networks. So I think that idea that there's no longer one broadcaster or a set of single broadcasters, whether it's the government or CNN or the BBC or whatever, but that there's been a democratization in a certain sense, or at least a pluralization of speakers, and the speakers don't mimic the old speakers with a top-down verticality. They can talk in multiple directions at multiple times to multiple audiences, and that there are feedback loops and interactions at different points in networks about different things and through different nodes. So that's clearly, enormously valuable for assembling political communities of all sorts. And I think you're right. Many of us were captivated at the dawn of the digital era by the idea that the centralized powers would be radically destabilized by the fact that lots of other people could talk to lots of other people in a way that had formerly been monopolized by states and powerful media. And I think that's true. It's not that didn't happen. And I think it still continues to happen. As you and I are talking, we're overhearing at a distance what's happening in Iran. And these incredible protests, which are definitely moving laterally and horizontally, are evading to a certain extent the government, or are able to withstand. They have a certain resilience and are able to withstand even violent repression by the government and proliferate. So it's not like this possibility went away or was definitively crushed or erased. I think a couple of things happened. So I'm speaking generally of the human rights defending progressive side of the political spectrum, kind of forgot at the beginning that the other end of the political spectrum could do exactly the same thing, and for different purposes, and maybe even sometimes they do invoke notions about human rights, but not usually. Usually, human rights is the name of the enemy rather than the friend. But still, the technologies and the opportunities that they afforded their users were available to people at all positions on the political spectrum, not just governments, right? Other civic, what you could call, I don't know, grassrootsy movements were able to harness the same equipment and the same strategies that protesters from the left wing of the spectrum were able to do. And I think we've seen that in various places. So without the government even getting involved, although sometimes maybe these movements were government sponsored, nevertheless, that was one wake-up call, was that politics and political mobilization was possible across the spectrum, and not just at the so-called progressive or democratic end of it. Then we also learned that maybe actually I'll pause for a second there. The place that I learned this, it will betray my age a little bit, but I learned this most forcefully when I was involved in various activist movements during the war in Bosnia. Okay. So early 90s, say. And there were ideas that they were pretty, by today's standards, pretty primitive uses of the internet. They were dial-up modems and bulletin boards and places where people from across Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and around the world could talk to each other. And some of us thought somewhat naively that just getting people to talk with each other would be an important way of controlling or managing the conflict. It turns out that people say all kinds of wild things when they're able to talk to each other. They don't just campaign for rights. They shut people down. They promote hatred. They support the genocidal militias and so on. So realizing that opening up and democratizing spaces of expression could go in all different ways. And if you ask for a free speech space, you got to be prepared for all kinds of free speech to happen there. So that was, I think that was one big lesson, but also that government intervention, when governments feared the speech that was able to travel more freely and more horizontally with more speakers, governments were capable of suppressing it, of channeling it, of surveilling it, and so on. I think a lot of us lived by that motto that what was the phrase? The internet treats censorship as damage and routes around it. That was a famous line from, I think, the Hacker Manifesto of early 1990s. But in fact, in many cases, the internet didn't treat censorship merely as damage and routed around it. The internet got stuck. The internet got clogged by censors, by surveillance operations, and so on. I remember our colleague, Masha Gessen, gave an amazing paper at a conference I organized in 97 or something about the internet in Russia, which at that point felt kind of wide open, post 89, so on. And Masha's paper was titled Internet, so interno, right? And Masha showed how in the hands of a appropriately or sufficiently ruthless and intelligent government, internet freedom was pretty fictional and not too easy to make use of. So I think both the idea that the political spectrum is very broad, and when the internet and digital media open up, it's there for everybody, and the fact that governments can repress or harness the power as well. Those were really important lessons when thinking about human rights and digital media.
Yeah. After this discussion, I want to focus on the nature of censorship, right? So in an authoritarian government, pre-internet age, the government could directly control the radio or the TV or the newspaper. But the nature of censorship has been changed in digital era, right? You shared an article with me. I was going through that one by Tim Wu, a New York Times article, and the title is "The First Amendment Obsolete?" And there he was trying to analyze the nature of the presence of First Amendment in the digital age, and the question is it obsolete now? So he was like analyzing the pattern of censorship in Russia, in China, in Turkey, and the finding is there is no direct censorship nowadays in digital era. Rather, the governments and those who want to censor the people's views, they have developed new kind of methods, and they deploy troll armies, ridicule the people who are critic to the government. They have their own method of flooding of pro-government messages, and also they create fake news that goes for the government. So these are some new methods. So they are not censoring anything, but they are creating a huge volume of new kind of pro-ruler discourses. The volume is so huge that the other people, they get confused, and they actually actually struggle to find the fact and the truth. So this is an interesting observation. What do you think about this censorship procedure in the digital era?
I think the article by Timothy Wu and the whole research project that I think he was engaged in is fascinating. And you're right. We've tended, I think, in general, free speech advocates around the world have tended to see the repressive hand of the government, or sometimes, private entities working on behalf of governments, or governments in collusion with private entities, as a kind of a, throttles or machines that say no, machines that suppress and repress an otherwise beneficial flow of speech by stopping it. And I mean, that's the logic of certainly the US First Amendment, is simply that the government shall make no law that prohibits freedom of expression. Yeah. So the government is seen as having the potential to say no, and is prohibited by the Constitution from doing that. And I think generally that model extends elsewhere. So you might be worried that Twitter is going to act like a government. And in fact, there's some interesting scholarship on that notion of the new governors being social media platforms. Or Facebook is going to remove your posts or whatever. So the idea is they act like governments of yesteryear. And they do. It's not untrue. And governments also still do act like censors in the old-fashioned sense. All you have to do is look at, Chinese state control of social media, and there are actual armies, not just troll armies, but armies of actual people whose job it is to remove mentions of Tiananmen Square or references to what's happening to the Uyghur population or whatever. So there is active censorship. But Wu's argument, which I think is really persuasive, is that in addition to that, there is this whole other kind of almost like affirmative action, not negative or repressive action, but positive, not in the value sense, but in the energy sense, positive action of making it much harder. So without needing to censor, making it much harder for the voices that you might once have wanted to censor to get a hearing by drowning them out with all kinds of noise, whether it's disinformation, whether it's the confusion that fake news introduces. And I think fake news is particularly dangerous, not because it tells people lies exactly, but because it makes people, it deprives people of the ability to tell the truth from the lie. It's a confusing device. It's a destabilizing device. It's a way of rendering everything kind of epistemologically unreliable, because, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. So you don't really need to figure out what the thing is that's true and what's not, and so on. So fake news, robot repeater devices that just make the column of comments on your Twitter post so exhaustingly long that no one even bothers to pay attention. So all those devices which are productive rather than repressive devices. I think that's what Wu noticed, and I think it is really true, and it's hard to know what to do about it, partly because all that noise and that increased engagement, as they say in the social media world, is not a flaw. It's not a bug in the model of how Twitter works. It's exactly how Twitter is designed to work. It's designed to increase the noise, to make more people post, to make more people look. And if the posters are robots, up to a certain point, Twitter doesn't care. They are also, on the other hand, shameable. I think the digital media platforms have shown that they can, if they want to, respond when platforms are clearly causing harm, and the structure of platforms are causing harm. But I think the threshold to get them to respond is pretty high. So going there looking for salvation is probably not such a great idea.
Mm. And next idea is coming in my mind about the nature of surveillance after this discussion of censorship. People are surveilled by these digital platforms. These are ultimate surveillance machines, and through cookies and everything, that this internet and digital media, they are actually surveilling the users for their business purposes. But at the same time, the governments or the big private figures, they are doing it with new kind of intercept machines. And what do you think about this this kind of surveillance? So we are not aware of the whole privacy thing or this say surveillance thing. There's a vulnerability of these users, and let alone doing activism and defending human rights. Every individual is very much vulnerable in terms of their privacy. They have been surveilled 24/7, right? So what do you think about this?
I think two or three things. So surveillance, if you go back to your Foucault, one of the dangers of surveillance was that it would induce self-censorship. If you know that you're being watched, then you watch yourself and you control what you say. So the famous idea of the chilling effect. If the government is watching you, you're much less likely to speak your mind or engage in a protest, and so on. So you internalize the surveillance apparatus. Interestingly, it doesn't, I mean, I think that does happen in some cases, but it feels to me like what we've learned over these few years of big digital platforms collecting tons and tons of data is that people aren't actually self-censoring very much. Maybe in hot situations where there is the possibility of active, political repression or legal consequences and so on. But I don't know if it's an irony or paradox or something, is that knowledgeable people seem willing to give up the privacy of their speech in exchange for the opportunity to talk to other people, to talk about themselves, and so on. So the chilling effect, the kind of rerouted censorship that surveillance can be, seems less prominent in the digital age, and then the more old-fashioned repression that is enabled by constant surveillance is back in the game. But I think it's complicated in a scary and interesting way by the fact that it's not just kind of the real-time surveillance camera watching you as you break into the store or whatever. It's that there are years and years and years and years and years of data, much of it which you wouldn't even think about being stored and hence needing to protect, which is assembled into databases, which is cross-referenced with other databases, and very, very rich digital pictures of who you are, who your friends are, what you like to eat, where you like to go, what you like to watch, are sitting massive, massive mines of data, which go back a long way. So the surveillance is not just forward-looking; it can be retrospective as well, and is maybe even more powerful and dangerous retrospectively. Patterns can be identified, and you can be held responsible formally or informally for things that you barely even knew you were doing in the past. So I think that combination of big data analytics, artificial intelligence deployed on databases which are pretty much inadvertently generated just by users' behavior, is also a really important element of the new surveillance story.
Also, I was thinking about in some countries, I know about my country. I'm from Bangladesh, and I know this surveillance, whether there's an authoritarian government ruling at the moment, and they have been using these blessings of social media. They can surveil people very well, and they have developed a kind of legal frameworks which is very, very strict, and which is very conflicting with the spirit of the constitution itself. But the same kind of writing, that might be lesser punishment in if you write in the print media, and if you write in the digital media, it would be much more higher degree of punishments. And the legal framework is it is called Digital Security Act 2018, and it is developed in a way anything you write, you can be caught. And sometimes they use this to arrest people. Sometimes they don't use. It depends on their wish and desires. So these digital platforms are, instead of being used as a means of defending human rights, rather they are the human rights activists. They are actually persecuted for using this digital media. So how do you see, especially in the post-Arab Spring time, the governments are very much aware about the situation, and actually they have striked back. Nowadays, the citizens are actually defeated by the being surveilled and being persecuted by the governments. How do you see this? It might be different from the USA, but it is happening in many countries in the world.
Yeah, I think, as we've been saying, the people's exposure online is very risky in the face of authoritarian regimes or their private versions. So I would say yes. There's a lot to be chastened by from the examples of the Arab Spring or of the Syrian civil war, which is maybe an offshoot of that, and so many other examples. The Iranian election protests of whatever that was, 14 or 15 years ago, where it seemed like the very media that protesters thought belonged to them was capable of being, hijacked, harnessed, repurposed, or just purposed by exactly the people who were the target of the protests. So the government could study the protest videos, which had been very valuable for organizing more protests, and learn exactly who was at the protests. With a little bit of face recognition technology and so on, you could have a pretty good map of who your political opponents were, and then go and arrest them or worse. So yeah, I think that was a wake-up call. But I think it's important also to talk about the flip side, because there's always a flip side here. There's a move and a counter move and a counter move and so on. So protesters develop encryption technologies. There are really interesting activist projects that allow people to, digitally alter the faces in the images that they shoot from a protest in near real time before they post them. So the NGO Witness has been doing a lot of really interesting work in making, easy to use software that people can take with them on their phone to the protest, and it protects them and their neighbors against a fair bit of this intrusion. So there's always another move. It's obviously an unequal battle, but I think it still is a battle, and there are a lot of innovative ways that people are trying to respond to the weaponization or the repurposing of digital media. I think another dimension of that is a kind of, you could call it like civic counter surveillance. Yes, the state can surveil, and yes, the digital platforms can surveil, but in the same way that repressive governments can go data mining, human rights activists can go image and data mining as well. And the kind of implicit or inadvertent archive that social media constitutes for the investigations of state violence, of police brutality, of everything. I think that we can't discount that either. I'm thinking of the work of civic digital forensics units. Like there's one at Berkeley that does digital verification, a digital verification lab, forensic architecture in London and elsewhere. The visual investigations teams now of lots of major news outlets, which treat social media postings as raw material for human rights investigations or journalistic analyses. We, just today in the New York Times, I was reading their interpretation of the current protests in Iran, the women's rights and democracy protests, and they have a window through social media into this landscape, which the Iranian government has more or less successfully kept out of the mainstream. But that horizontality, that we talked about earlier, the networkiness, coupled with a whole lot of forensic tools that enable investigators pretty quickly to verify whether what they think they're seeing is actually what they're seeing, whether the video is what it claims to be, and so on, really allows people to assemble very powerful narratives, mappings, analytic resources for understanding state power and countering it. So I think, it's the old cat and mouse scenario. And yeah, the cat is bigger. But the mouse can be wilier here. So I'm not giving up on this. I think it's just a matter of knowing where you are in the counter game, and having the courage to do it and use it and make it public.
Okay, I have last one area to. It is in the context of the USA. So we had experienced one anti-globalization protest in the late 90s. Yeah. Also in 2010s, there's a Occupy movement, right? And very recently, there's a Black Lives Matter movement. But meanwhile, we have also experienced the Trump era, which is a rise of, say, right-wing populism. So how do you see the human rights situation within the USA and the possibility of liberal and progressive environment in near future?
It's such a complicated country you've found yourself in.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything can happen. That's my motto here. So yeah, and lots of different contradictory things happen at the same time. So, and many of them propelled and energized by forces, by technological forces that are indistinguishable from each other. So, I think the January 6th riot attempted overturning of a popular electoral result. As we all know, was organized and propelled by various, maybe not as obvious as Facebook, but rather similar to Facebook, digital media platforms. And at roughly the same time, you have, as you mentioned, Black Lives Matter. You have other movements. You have the Me Too movement, which is, maybe less visual and more textual, but same logic. So it's just, I don't know that there's a rule here. It's very contingent. It's about mobilization. It's about making the best use of these technologies in particular circumstances. I think it's also about what you do afterwards. So of course the January 6th assault on the Capitol was propelled by Parler, if that's how you pronounce the name of that platform. But it has also been exhaustively documented and reconstructed in like microsecond level detail, and its perpetrators identified and people held to account by exactly the same vehicle that made it happen in the first place. So I'm always going to go just A then B, B then C, back and forth here. And I think it's a super polarized country. And so we shouldn't be surprised at any given moment that the side that seems to be losing is able to come back and be the side that seems to be winning, or that new sides emerge, and so on. So I'm still, I'm not people accuse me always of being a little too optimistic, and maybe that's true. But I think that the vocabulary and the power of making claims about rights, about civil rights and about human rights, is still very much alive.
I can give you one outsider view. That is, the president, he looked like a president from a corrupt third world country. Okay, his approach and language and everything. But this country has developed many institutions over the years, over the decades, and that institutions actually saved the transition of power and everything. So I think that will save ultimately this country, at least as I see in the recent past what happened.
So maybe you're more of an optimist than I am. I think the institutions, were tested rather harshly, and they didn't always.
Yeah, he tried to influence those institutions, but ultimately the institutions survived. That is my point.
The institutions need activists behind them. The institutions need popular support. They need political mobilization. I think if the US just relies on the institutions and doesn't take care of them, doesn't nurture them, defend them, support them with active political engagement, we can't count on them. So they are responsive to public will, and if all the public will is on the side that's ultimately going to destroy the institutions, that's a dangerous possibility. So yes, institutions, but also mobilization, including platform-based mobilization behind them.
Okay, thank you. It was a nice discussion. Thanks for joining me. And I enjoyed the conversation. I don't know what or how much you enjoyed, but I enjoyed the conversation.
I enjoyed it very much, and I'm looking forward to following the future conversations that you have with others on related topics.
Okay,
so thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks again, and we are concluding the discussion here.
Okay.